All right, wrapping up the final part of chapter 6. Bod just met back up with Silas and they're headed back to the graveyard. Kind of a tense moment. Maureen Quilling had had the worst week of her life. Nick Farthing was no longer speaking to her. Her Uncle Tam had shouted at her about the Owens kid thing, then told her not to mention anything about that evening ever to anyone, or he could lose his job and he wouldn't want to be in her shoes if that happened. Her parents were furious with her. She felt betrayed by all the world. Even the year sevens weren't scared of her any longer. It was rotten. She wanted to see that Owens kid, who she blamed for everything that had happened to her so far, writhing in miserable agony. If he thought being arrested was bad, and then she would concoct elaborate revenge schemes in her head, complex and vicious. They were the only thing that made her feel better, and even they didn't really help. If there was one job that gave Mo the creeps, it was cleaning up the science labs, putting away the Bunsen burners, making sure that all the test tubes, petri dishes, unused paper filters, and the like were returned to their places. She only had to do it on a strict rotation system once every 2 months, but it stood to reason that here, in the worst week of her life, she would be in the science lab. At least Mrs. Hawkins, who taught general sciences, was there, collecting papers, gathering things up at the end of the day. Having her there, having anybody there, was comforting. "You're doing a good job, Maureen," said Mrs. Hawkins. A white snake in a jar of preservative stared blindly down at them. Mo said, "Thanks." "Aren't there meant to be 2 of you?" asked Mrs. Hawkins. "I was supposed to be doing it with the Owens kid," said Mo, "but he hasn't been to school in days now." The teacher frowned. "Which one is he?" she asked, absently. "I don't have him down on my list." "Bob Owens, brownish hair, a bit too long, didn't talk much. He was the one who named all the bones of the skeleton in the quiz, remember?" "Not really," admitted Mrs. Hawkins. "You must remember. Nobody remembers him, not even Mr. Kirby." Mrs. Hawkins pushed the rest of the sheets of paper into her bag and said, "Well, I appreciate you doing it on your own, dear. Don't forget to wipe down the working surfaces before you go." And she went, closing the door behind her. The science labs were old. There were long, dark wooden tables with gas jets and taps and sinks built into them, and there were dark wooden shelves upon which were displayed a selection of things in large bottles. The things that floated in the bottles were dead, had been dead for a long time. There was even a yellowed human skeleton in one corner of the room. Mo did not know if it was real or not, but right now it was creeping her out. Every noise she made echoed in that long room. She turned all of the overhead lights on, giving even the light on the whiteboard, just to make the place less scary. The room began to feel cold. She wished she could turn up the heat. She walked over to one of the large metal radiators and touched it. It was burning hot, but still she was shivering. The room was empty and unsettling in its emptiness, and Mo felt as if she were not alone, as if she was being watched. "Well, of course I'm being watched," she thought. 100 dead things in jars are all looking at me, not to mention the skeleton. She glanced up at the shelves. That was when the dead things in the jars began to move. A snake with unseeing milky eyes uncoiled in its alcohol-filled jar. A faceless, spiny sea creature twisted and revolved in its liquid home. A kitten, dead for decades, showed its teeth and clawed the glass. Mo closed her eyes. "This isn't happening," she told herself. "I'm imagining it." "I'm not frightened," she said aloud. "That's good," said someone standing in the shadows by the rear door. "It seriously sucks to be frightened." She said, "None of the teachers even remember you." "But you remember me," said the boy, the architect of all her misfortunes. She picked up a glass beaker and threw it at him, but her aim went wide and it smashed against a wall. "How's Nick?" asked Bod, as if nothing had happened. "You know how he is," she said. "He won't even talk to me. Just shuts up in class, goes home and does his homework, probably building model railways." "Good," he said. "And you," she said, "you haven't been in school for a week. You're in such trouble, Bob Owens. The police came in the other day. They were looking for you." "That reminds me. How's your Uncle Tam?" said Bod. Mo said nothing. In some ways, said Bod, you've won. I'm leaving school, and in other ways you haven't. Have you ever been haunted, Maureen Quilling? Ever looked in the mirror, wondering if the eyes looking back at you were yours? Ever sat in an empty room and realized that you were not alone? It's not pleasant. You're going to haunt me? Her voice trembled. Bod said nothing at all. He just stared at her. In the far corner of the room, something crashed. Her bags had slipped off the chair onto the floor, and when she looked back, she was alone in the room. Or at least there was nobody there that she could see. There's nobody that she could see in there with her. Her way home was going to be very long and very dark. The boy and his guardian stood at the top of the hill, looking out at the lights of the town. Does it still hurt? Asked the boy. A little, said his guardian, but I heal fast. I'll soon be as good as ever. Could it have killed you, stepping out in front of that car? His guardian shook his head. There are ways to kill people like me, he said, but they don't involve cars. I am very old and very tough. Bod said, I was wrong, wasn't I? The whole idea was to do it without anybody noticing, and then I had to go get involved with the kids in the school, and the next thing you know, there's police and all sorts of stuff, because I was selfish. Silas raised an eyebrow. You weren't selfish. You need to be among your own kind. Quite understandable. It's just harder out there in the world of the living, and we cannot protect you out there as easily. I wanted to keep you perfectly safe, said Silas, but there is only one perfectly safe place for your kind, and you will not reach it until all your adventures are over and none of them matter any longer. I wonder what Silas means. Bod rubbed his hand over the stone of Thomas R. Stout, 1817 to 1851, deeply regretted by all who knew him. Feeling the moss crumble beneath his fingers. He's still out there, said Bod, the man who killed my first family. I still need to learn about people. Are you going to stop me leaving the graveyard? No, that was a mistake, and one we have both learned from. Then what? We should do our best to satisfy your interest in stories and books and the world. There are libraries, there are other ways, and there are many situations in which there might be other living people around you, like the theater or the cinema. What's that? Is it like football? I enjoyed watching them play football at school. Football? That's usually a little early in the day for me, said Silas. But Miss Lupescu could take you to see a football match the next time she's here. I'd like that, said Bod. They began to walk down the hill. Silas said, We have both left too many tracks and traces in the last few weeks. They are still looking for you, you know. You said that before, said Bod. How do you know? And who are they? And what do they want? But Silas only shook his head and would be drawn no further, and with that, for the time being, Bod had to be satisfied. Interesting developments. So Bod's experiment with school went a little bit awry, but it sounds like they have a plan maybe for how they're going to make sure that Bod doesn't lose contact with the living world. Until next time.